Hello, everybody. For this latest video, I'd like to talk about Richard Dawkins, probably the world's most famous and influential atheist alive today. He's been a very prominent figure in leading people away from faith in many cases and strengthening the unbelief of others. And while I'm a big fan of his works on biology, I think he's done an incredible job in explicating uh, the subject of biology in a way that's accessible and brilliantly written, beautifully written in many cases. When he strays into the areas outside of his expertise, like philosophy and theology and faith, etc., he is, in my view, found really severely lacking. So much so that I can't believe that anyone could have read The God Delusion or listened to him talk about religion and found that to be strong enough to abandon their faith or claim that these are good arguments against God. So I'm going to critique some of those ideas now that he's put forward. And in fairness to Richard Dawkins, I've not just gone online and found stuff that's unrepresentative of him or where he's gone off the boil or where he's said something that he regrets or caught him off guard or misquoted, anything like that. I've picked some of the quotes that I've seen and heard regularly in his works on atheism and also on his YouTube videos as well. So this is representative of what Richard Dawkins frequently says. So I don't think anyone could accuse me of being unfair. I'm going to pick him at what he thinks I would imagine is his best on the subject, and I'm going to show why it's very, very severely lacking. So I'm just going to try to share my screen. It's a very basic slideshow, but it's just pulling up some quotes of Richard Dawkins. So hopefully that should come up now. And let me just see if I can move it across slide by slide. So hopefully this is visible. And this is the first one. It says, where does Darwinian evolution leave God? The kindest thing to say is that it leaves him with nothing to do and no achievements that might attract our praise, our worship, or our fear. Evolution is God's redundancy notice, his pink slip. Now, this is one of his most famous quotes, and he says it and is happy for it to be quoted a lot. So it must be something he is really pleased with. But for me, it's one of the worst things he could possibly say on the subject. So if you notice what he does in conveying the power of evolutionary theory as an explanatory agent for the diversity of life on this planet, which he does often very well, here he's offering a fact that has nothing to do with the issues surrounding God's existence or non-existence at all. And so then he draws a conclusion that employs poor reasoning and absurdity in its imaginative failings, if anything. But biological evolution, yes, it explains all of life on Earth from abiogenesis, which is the first spark of life, through to the rich and diverse complexities of life we see after a few billion years of natural selection. But biological evolution, of course, it doesn't imply that God has nothing to do. That's as silly as saying that filling a hotel with staff and guests implies that there was nothing for the planners and builders to do in constructing the hotel, which is a point I've made before, I believe, in one of my essays. Biological evolution, it only explains the relatively easy part. That is, once we've got the laws of physics up and running and the mathematical underpinnings and the informational platform, then biological life, once it gets going, is a relatively straightforward step-by-step cumulative selection process. Certainly in comparison to things like creating a universe and designing the complex physical laws and the mathematical front loading that I've mentioned before in my works. That act as a canvas for the colors and the textures, if you like, of the evolution of life. The hard part is in explaining why the universe is made of mathematics and why there is any mathematics at all, if you want to talk about it in sort of Dawkins-esque senses. That Richard Dawkins makes such a crass misjudgment in this quote, in ignoring the hard part to point out the easy part, if you like. What can it say about him? And only to suggest that he's either being insincere or he's just very clueless on this type of subject. It's astounding that someone who's so prominent in the world would say such a thing. In my view, it's absurd. Then we get on to the next famous quote of his. One of the truly bad effects of religion is that it teaches us that it is a virtue to be satisfied with not understanding. Now, really, I mean, this is... If only he places the word sometimes between the words it and teaches. Maybe it does sometimes teach that. Sometimes religion makes a mess of things. But then you just have with the tautology. Sometimes religion teaches people to be satisfied with not understanding, and sometimes it doesn't, which is a fairly inadequate thing to be saying. I mean, there was definitely some dubious things that have come out of religious teaching, but Dawkins really only means, I think, that one of the truly bad effects of religion is that sometimes this stuff happens. Sometimes, one of the bad effects of going to school is that some pupils fail their exams or due to underachievement, or sometimes they suffer bullying. But does Richard Dawkins think that means schools are a bad thing? I doubt it. So religion at its best is the study of subjects that help us to enhance our understanding and our curiosity. To say that that religion teaches this stuff to teach us to be unsatisfied or to be satisfied with not understanding is a curious lack of imagination and lack of understanding for the breadth and depth and the gravitas of religion. Next one. Here he says, another famous quote: faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is the belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. So look what he's doing here. It's this classic perennial misunderstanding of the word faith. Faith is not something that we just believe without evidence or have any reason to believe in. So Dawkins is changing the word faith to mean something that is generally thought to be bad, evading the need to think and evaluate evidence, which we all agree isn't a good thing. And then he makes an appeal based on that fabrication. And this is, of course, a popular trick that the politicians play on too. They change the meaning of the word and then they make an argument because they want you to believe a certain thing. And this is what Richard Dawkins does frequently. If that were an accurate depiction of the word faith, then Dawkins would be quite right to criticize it. Just as if my depiction of the historical record of Hitler was an accurate depiction of, say, Martin Luther King, then I'd be right to criticize Martin Luther King for Hitler's crimes. But of course, that's not how life works. With Dawkins, faith is not what he paints it to be. Having faith says little about someone's willingness to evaluate evidence, as evidence for anything empirical is confined only to the classes of object that are part of the physical substrate: physics, biology, chemistry, economics, whatever. Having faith is to have an interpretation of reality as a whole. It's an interpretation of of all things connected to the physical substrate, but that are part of a much bigger divine plan. Metaphysical concepts, trusting in God, trusting in who he says he is based on the reasons we have to believe. Trusting that through the incarnation we can trust that God's plan is being played out. Faith has nothing to do with the kind of evidence Dawkins means when he uses that word. So it's an appallingly bad proposition to put forward. The next quote is, he says, "Do you really mean to tell me that the only reason you try to be good is to gain God's approval and reward, or to avoid his disapproval and punishment? That's not morality," he says. "That's just sucking up, apple polishing, looking over your shoulder at the great surveillance camera in the sky." So this is an example of a statement that has universal appeal. It's again one of his popular quotes, but in having such low-hanging appeal, it really says nothing compelling at all. I mean, just look at what the statement consists of. I don't know any believer, literally not one, who lives a life of such bereft and tremulous servitude that they would only do good because of gaining approval from God. There probably are religious people in North Korea, maybe, or people in servile dictatorships who may do things for the approval of their leader, but most educated people, thoughtful believers, understand that morality is an evolved phenomenon. And the moral imperatives are both beneficial and necessary for human survival and fruitful coexistence, irrespective of whether one believes in God or not. The fact that Dawkins peddles this distortion suggests to me that he either doesn't understand why people believe in God, or that he's trying to mislead people. And I don't think he is trying to mislead people deliberately. I just think the statements are so inadequate. I mean, what on earth makes him think that Christians only try to be good to gain God's approval? It's just not something that we do. We value goodness for its own intrinsic qualities, and we accept morality as an evolved phenomenon that we've tried to crystallize and develop over time, and we accept that God is the ultimate goodness and that Christ's act on the cross was the ultimate act of grace. But it's nothing like Dawkins thinks it is with his quote. The next one. "There's something infantile in the presumption that somebody else has a responsibility to give your life meaning and point. The truly adult view, and by contrast, is that our life is as meaningful, as full, and as wonderful as we choose to make it." So this is an example, I think, of a statement that it contains a false dichotomy and at least a couple of false assumptions here. So the first false assumption is that to be a theist means living a childish life in which believers simply delegate all responsibility onto others in some puerile manner. I mean, that obviously isn't the case. Theists have faith and trust, as I said before, in an all-powerful God. But as far as the day-to-day living is concerned, they understand that life is full of personal responsibility and meaning. And of course, many take it upon themselves to go the extra few miles and campaign for social justice or global changes inspired by Christ's instructions, things to do for the poor and all this kind of stuff. And it's and the second false assumption is that it's infantile to presume that somebody else has a responsibility to give your life meaning. If we take the overly emotive word responsibility, we all know that it's other people that do give our lives meaning. There's nothing to be ashamed of in acknowledging this, and certainly nothing exclusive to theism here. We all rely on each other for love, for friendship, for knowledge, for aspiration, for a sense of purpose. And, even Richard Dawkins relies on these things. And if you place those two false assumptions together, you'll see that Dawkins here has created a false dichotomy. That it's absurd to think that without religion, then the meaning has more value and that it has less value because we're only doing it to seek responsibility through others because we're religious. Next quote. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So the obvious problem here, of course, is that how does Richard Dawkins know what the difference would be between properties in a created universe and properties in a universe that isn't created? He can't know this because if the universe is created, then its properties that we observe are created properties. And if it isn't created, then its properties are what you might call naturalistic. But Dawkins, like all of us, we have no conceptual wherewithal of any ontological distinction between the two types of universe he's putting forward. As an illustration, I use this in my book. If a dressmaker states that a particular piece of clothing has been sewn wrong, then her argument is rational because she has a clear idea of what a correct stitch pattern would look like. But if we make the same claim regarding our universe, if we say that the universe is not fine-tuned, or that it was not created by a god and has just the wrong kind of stitch pattern, if you like, then we must know what a wrong stitch pattern is in relation to a right one. Now, as far as we know, nature could have brought about the same stitch pattern in a created universe or a Dawkins-esque naturalistic universe. So there were no grounds for such an assertion by Richard Dawkins. And presumably Dawkins doesn't really think that there is nothing but blind, pitiless indifference in his ontological inquiries. He presumably thinks that he has created meaning and purpose to his own life. So I presume he'll willingly admit that all humans are able to create their own meaning and purpose as well, which means at the very least, the universe has created billions of creatures who have developed deep concepts of meaning and purpose, which goes to show that there is, there's quite a bit more than blind, pitiful indifference in nature. And that the question of whether those deep concepts relate to even deeper truths not yet understood is a matter that hasn't been resolved. So next quote. So it's best to keep an open mind and be agnostic. At first sight, that seems an unassailable position, at least in the weak sense of Pascal's wager. But on second thoughts, it seems a cop-out, because the same could be said of Father Christmas and tooth fairies. There may be fairies at the bottom of the garden. There is no evidence for it, but you can't prove that there aren't any. So shouldn't we be agnostic with respect to fairies? Again, what an absurd thing to say. I mean, does he really? It's the sort of emotional propaganda that seeks to manipulate readers by conflating two concepts as though they are just one interchangeable entity. Things that are genuinely believed to be real, like God, and things that are acknowledged by anyone above the age of 6 or 7 to be fantastical fabrications like Santa Claus. Santa Claus is made up by parents for kids' enjoyment. Philosophy of religion, metaphysics, and arguments for and against God's existence, they amount to a long, broad, and deep inquiry that has preoccupied human thinking for millennia and continues to this day. I wonder if anyone has ever actually asked Richard Dawkins why he and his fellow cronies are not out there debating Santa Claus on stage or writing books about why Santa Claus doesn't exist. If he tells you that that's an entirely different realm of discourse to philosophy of religion, etc., metaphysics, and arguments for God's existence, then you'll be entitled to ask, why would you make such a statement? And what valuable point do you think you're making by treating those two things that are so different as though they're the same in the above quote? It's Dawkins thinks that God and Santa Claus are the same by being non-existent, of course, but that's to commit the fallacy of begging the question, which is assuming the conclusion of an argument that God does not exist, when that is the question being discussed. And at the very heart of the human inquiry into meaning and ontology and causality and all of the deep questions. It's as silly as saying that opium makes us tired because it has sleep-inducing properties, or smoking causes cancer because it has cancer-inducing properties. It's one thing to find a causal link, which we certainly have, say, in the case of smoking and cancer. But it's quite another to foolishly assume a conclusion in the sentence because the causal links have been put together so carelessly. It's a shocking statement from Richard Dawkins. Next quote. I'm against religion because it teaches us to be satisfied with not understanding the world. Or perhaps I would paraphrase it this way. I'm against Richard Dawkins because he teaches his admirers to be satisfied with not understanding poor arguments. If we stick to his exact words, we see they are so general that they're meaningless. It teaches us to be satisfied with not understanding the world. Even if we ignore his failure to define what it means to understand the world, what about all the religious people that understand the world better than Richard Dawkins? What does he suppose that religion has taught those people? What? Such generalizations are so misjudged, as any sensible person, whether they're a theist or a non-theist, would rightly repudiate such a sloppy sentence, and they would rightly repudiate not being satisfied with the world or being satisfied with not understanding the world. What Dawkins really means here is people who don't share his views don't understand the world as well as he does, which is an unsubstantiated, ego-stroking statement that carries no weight at all. So, next quote. The feeling of awed wonder that science can give us is one of the highest experiences of which the human psyche is capable. It is a deep aesthetic passion to rank with the finest that music and poetry can deliver. It is truly one of the things that make life worth living. And it does so, if anything, more effectively if it convinces us that the time we have for living is quite finite. So notice the false assumption here. The wonder of science convinces us that the time we have for living is finite. But why does it? Being startled by science simply means that we're being startled by discoveries about the physical universe, all of which amount to physical creatures making discoveries about other physical phenomena. these discoveries, they say nothing about whether there is more to reality than the physical. So by definition, they cannot inform us of whether our experience and our existence will be finite. They may not. They may indicate that our physical existence is ultimately finite. They may indicate that, but the Christian faith also expresses that view. So it's not really saying anything against religious belief. But there's a further point to consider here with this quote. Although natural selection may have endowed us with the mental resources necessary for survival and for reproduction and safety and learning and what have you, what strikes me as incredible about the human mind is that these aren't the things actually that it finds most fascinating. It finds more fascinating things like the things that one might consider to be the subsidiary facets to human life, and certainly in the evolutionary sense, it's not the necessary things like food and water and oxygen, sunlight that fill us with awe. It's not as much as the unnecessary things do, like love and beauty and sublimity and music and poetry, literature, art, faith, philosophy, the picturesque natural world and the astounding mathematical patterns in nature that really, they're the things that really fill us with awe. They are the things they're the things we really wouldn't want to be without, although we shouldn't diminish our appreciation for the natural world, of course. It really does feel at times as like we were created for another world altogether, and that is the life with the most exhilarating narrative, I think. Yeah, and perhaps that's what the writer of Ecclesiastes means when he says, that God has set eternity in our hearts, that not that we should fail to marvel at nature and enjoy this life as it is, but that we should marvel and enjoy nature in preparation for something even better. But either way, there are no grounds for using studies of the physical universe to project ideas about the kind of temporality that Richard Dawkins is trying to convey. And the last one is this scale of belief or unbelief that Dawkins put together. So it's the assumption that God needs no defining, which is a problem in this list he's put together. That's one of the problems. It needs a clearer definition. But in the God Delusion, he makes this classic error where he produces this popularity of favor or disfavor for God on a 7-point scale. And he goes from strong theist right the way down to strong atheist. And in stating where he sits on that scale, Dawkins puts himself as a 6, but leaning towards a 7. And again, he uses that quote, I'm agnostic only to the extent that I'm agnostic about the fairies at the bottom of the garden, which nobody believes him when he says that, of course. Of course he's not. But the reality is his 1 to 7 scale, it exhibits the kind of flawed thinking that even a nascent first-year philosophy student would surely see as absurd, as an indicator of strength of belief. The model is entirely meaningless because strength of belief is inextricably linked to whether one's position is philosophically good or bad, or how well thought through it is, and whether one has any reasonable justification for belief in God. In other words, anyone can tell you where their strength of belief sits on a made-up 1 to 7 scale, but it's only worth taking seriously if the person expressing the belief has a competent understanding of the subject and a good philosophical brain with which to reason and come up with these conclusions. As well as the model failing to pay any regard to the competency of the person doing the grading, the other thing that's wrong with the attempts to grade belief in God in a 1 to 7 scale is that he didn't even make the slightest mention of the fact that belief in God is just about the most diverse and complex subject out there, and that such an evaluation should be based on a hugely complex and varied mix of experiential protocols to which he's given no consideration. And, it's not simply that the 1 to 7 scale must be brought to bear in consideration for every instance of conceived God or gods in the world. I mean, that's one criticism. But I assume that the strength of belief for the Christian God would hardly be sensibly compared to, say, I don't know, the Baha'i faith, the God or one of the African rain gods. So even if we allow that to a rational and intelligent mind, all the gods in the world have co-equivalence in being able to be rejected, which we certainly don't. But even if we do, the 1 to 7 scale is still completely circular because it only gives expression of the rejection of the concept of God that each person has in their own mental toolbox. So rejection of God by a man like Dawkins, who has very little competence in the subjects of faith, theology, belief, and philosophy, has almost no meaningfulness at all. The reality is there's not a single 1 to 7 unique scale that Dawkins has created. There has to be one for every single person in the world, and then you have to measure that up against their conceptions of life, their experiences, their ideas, their mental abilities. And if Dawkins realized this, I think he'd realize how ineffectual it is. Even if we allow that one concept of God for every human being is, let's even agree that that's slightly excessive. It has to at least be acknowledged that an attempt to construct a scalar model of belief and treat it as a unique metric for philosophical returns is about as narrow-minded and parochial as it gets, and that's the same when Dawkins says that there's no evidence for God. That it's a statement that no one should ever make. What do you mean there's no evidence for God? What you really are saying is you've found no evidence, and what you mean by that is you haven't had the experiences that would lead you to the kind of place where you can accept evidence for God. To think that that is the same as saying there is no evidence for God, as though you are speaking for the experiences, both empirically and phenomenologically, of every single person that's ever lived. Nobody who's ever thought about this stuff would ever say the words, there is no evidence for God. They just wouldn't utter such a statement. So that's the last slide in the show. I hope that's been useful. I'm just going to stop sharing. As I said, I'm a big fan of Dawkins' works on biology, but it goes really downhill when he starts straying into the subjects that he doesn't really understand, and he doesn't have a competent understanding of the Bible either, which he seems to critique quite a lot. So I hope that was useful. I feel like I've only scratched the surface really with Dawkins, but I think I've picked the quotes that I've seen most prominently and most often, and tried to be fair to him and pick the ones that I think he believes are the strongest. And hopefully plan to do one on Christopher Hitchens too, who's I think equally lacking when he was alive, being a spokesperson for atheism. So hope that was useful. I hope you thought I was fair and reasonably minded and balanced on my critique. Obviously, he goes without saying, if ever Richard Dawkins happened to stumble upon this video and would like to discuss things further, I'd always be up for thrashing this out more thoroughly. But yeah, thank you for watching, and there's a description below which has a link to my blog, and thank you for participating and being a subscriber if you are, and please do subscribe if you're not. It really helps to get this stuff out there. So thank you, and yeah, see you in the next video.